what is supposed to save your family from major events that are likely to hit like waves. They might only come every 100 years, but they're going to come. And the person who's designed to save that family is the father.
Hey friends, welcome to the 1000 Houses podcast, where we encourage and equip households to make disciples in and through the home. Every episode, you'll hear interviews, teachings, and conversations around what it looks like to turn your home into a hub for mission, community, and discipleship. If you'd like to learn more about what entering into a season of coaching might look like for you and your household, visit 1kh.org for more info. Let's jump into today's episode.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the 1000 Houses podcast. April and I are doing our last morning in Langley, Washington. So gorgeous spot, this little Airbnb. Wanted to bring you guys one more episode. We're going to do something a little different. So I usually do sections of my book on my podcast, but I'm going to go ahead and release this one on the 1000 Houses podcast. This one's called Every Father a Prepper. And it's a section of my the book I'm working on called The Ruling Household. This is in chapter 3. So I'm working through Genesis from the perspective of a ruling household. And so I wanted to dive into Noah and some things we can learn from that multi-generational family line. So yeah, excited to do this. But how are you doing today, April?
Good. I'm doing good. Just been soaking in all the beauty around us and the views of the ocean and getting to visit our girls at camp. So it's been a really, really nice time.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I loved it. We're heading up to Orcas Island today. So we're kind of island hopping this week. It's one of the fun things about the Northwest and the epic map of all the islands in the San Juans and the Puget Sound. I'm going to get one of these. Awesome. All right. So I'm going to read this and then April get your take, and then we'll discuss this a little bit before, this goes out. So this is called Every Father a Prepper, the second part of chapter 3 in the book, The Ruling Household. So this is from Genesis 6. It says, "And God said to Noah, make yourself an ark." I'm sure most of you have met that special kind of guy who's always preparing for the apocalypse. That's the guy we laugh at when things are good and run to for help when things are bad. But one of the dynamics of building a multi-generational family is that in some generation, probably not too far in the future, things are going to get bad. So how does a family prepare for the chaos that hits society every 100 or so years? Be like Noah and build an ark with your adult sons. Fathers are built to think about contingency plans. Contingencies when the electricity goes, contingencies when there's a fire, contingencies when the food supply is threatened, contingencies for pandemics, depressions, and wars. Unfortunately, too many of us choose to trust the government for every contingency, which works great until it doesn't. The Jewish people have long memories and understand that disasters come in waves. That's why the Talmud, the series of books that make up the Jewish oral law, has this passage. Rebbe Yitzhak said, a person should always divide his money into 3, 1/3 in land, 1/3 in commerce, and 1/3 at hand. This approach, often referred to as Talmudic investing, creates stability for the family because you have a 1/3 in business to take advantage of economic boom times, a 1/3 in real estate to survive through economic busts, and a 1/3 in something easy to transport for when things get so bad you have to get out of Dodge. But I have 4 little kids and we're living paycheck to paycheck. And now you're saying I need to build an ark? No, friend, if that's your situation, you are not in the season for this kind of ark building. We have to start with the issues most likely to cause family problems. Your pathway to ark building may be saving a few months of salary into an emergency fund. Next, it might be building a business to allow you to make money in a way not always tied to your time. Then you may buy your first investment property. But when you're beginning to experience a greater degree of financial independence, don't lead your family into an ever increasing standard of living. Build an ark for a coming flood. So that's kind of the perspective from that Genesis 6 command given to Noah that I wanted to share. And then here's a tool, how to build an ark. We live in an unstable world. Between the chaos of the world and the vulnerability of the family, God has placed a father. Seasons of instability are often blessings that help us see what really matters. But if we don't properly prepare, these seasons of blessings can be times of real danger. I have this picture of looking down at a neighborhood of about 100 houses. Catastrophic events take down the power grid. But a few seconds later, you see the lights flickering back in half a dozen houses. Those houses are arks. Each one of these families is fathered by a man who is prepared to make his home self-sufficient in times of chaos, to protect his family and to bless his community. Ark building is not a command that we must follow, but Paul describes it as a goal each of us ought to have. He lists some goals in 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 and 12. Make it your goal. And the final one is, quote, that you will not need to depend on others. This goal of physical self-sufficiency is not for the purpose of being isolated, but he makes clear it's to allow us to be maximally generous. By the way, that word self-sufficiency, when I wrote this essay originally, people were kind of pushing back, hey, shouldn't we just call this financial independence? One of the problems is we don't actually have a really good word for this. Self-sufficiency, it sounds like not exactly biblical, and I understand. Like we're always needing to be dependent on God, dependent on his body, dependent on one another. That interdependence is better. But if you just say financial independence, that doesn't actually talk about things like electricity independence, water independence, food independence. And really what Paul is describing here is all of those things, right? So you will not have to be dependent on anyone. So I apologize for using the word self-sufficiency. I don't like that phrase, but I don't think there's really a great phrase. If you guys have one or can think of one, please share it with me. But that's kind of the one that most clearly describes what I think we're talking about here. All right. So the family who is struggling to survive through continual financial dependence will be unable to be maximally generous with those in need. So building an ark begins by simply making it a long-term goal. Our family has a series of steps toward preparing our ark. And here are the steps. Number one, you start by creating an emergency fund of 2 to 3 months of living expenses. So Dave Ramsey talked about that. Make sure that you're not just living paycheck to paycheck. So once you have that, number two, have a month's worth of emergency food in the house. So the food supply in most places is about a 3-day supply before it completely runs out. And so you don't want to be in that much dependence on the food supply in your area if something were to happen. Number three, get out of any debt not secured by assets. So one of the things that any kind of debt that's unsecured debt, like credit cards or whatever, those things are oftentimes things that are going to kind of take the arc down. So we want to be careful of those things. 4, stop living paycheck to paycheck by making most of our money through cash flowing assets. So part of what we want to be moving towards is to have a way of making income from the assets themselves. When your money makes money, that creates a lot more stability for a family. 5, have a secondary heat source for the house. So like a wood burning stove, or like what would you do in a winter? And of course, if you live in a hot area, that's not a big deal, but many of us live in places where this could be a serious issue. Number 6, install a secondary electricity source. And this is one of the things that I love that technology is improving, that this is becoming easier and easier to do. So generators, full house batteries, obviously using things like solar. So the combination between like finding another electricity source like solar and then storing it in batteries, like whole house batteries, is something that is getting cheaper and more popular in areas. So, and then I would say number 7, install a secondary water source. So one of the things that we did was we put a 3,000 gallon cistern that is fed by our gutters. So you don't have to be totally dependent on city water, even if you live in a city. Number 8, have a means of food production that is under your control. So this could be like having chickens, having a garden, canning. One of the things we got really into is indoor micro farming, which we can get into. But We've got a whole setup for that. You can basically grow about 10 pounds of produce a week against one wall of your house. It's crazy. So we live in a great day and age to create turn a house into an ark. And again, this is a fun project. So last thing, our family hasn't felt led to go full homestead. For ministry reasons, we live in a central location in our city, and our street adjoins an urban area. So we've had to get creative about how to move our family toward increasing physical self-sufficiency. As a father, I love going to bed at night knowing that my family is sleeping in a kind of ark that can withstand some tough storms and rocky times ahead. We don't live in fear. We seek first the kingdom of God, and we follow Paul's command to move towards a lifestyle of self-sufficiency plus generosity. Again, I know that word is kind of weird for some people, but you guys hear my heart when I'm saying. So yeah, April, anything in that's sticking out to you?
Well, I think Jesus said to us, I think it was in Matthew, where he says, like, know the times in which you live. Am I saying that right? Is that in Matthew? Where we're supposed to be paying attention to, we don't know exactly when he's coming. We don't know exactly when things are going to turn weird, but that we should be aware somehow. And so I think as believers, we walk this fine line of pushing forward in what today has for us, and then figuring out how to be preparing for the future and what that looks like and what our responsibility is and how much we should take on and all the stuff that you're saying. And so I feel like that there is the tension does exist, but I think that this is an encouragement to people who maybe have been resisting that, because it could sound a little weird. We all know the movies where there's these crazy people that have like bunkers and, they've like, they're way out there and they're isolated and have weapons, and we could think that they're weird or something like that. So I think that there's some legitimacy to this, and I'm having flashbacks of Y2K for those of you who are old enough to remember that when the year 2000 came, there was this big scare leading up to it in the late 90s that the computer systems, when they had been built, wouldn't be able to handle the year changing from 19. And so there was this all like, we don't know what's going to happen. It could crash all these systems. We should all be ready. We don't know what's going to happen to commerce and food production and all this stuff. And so that was my first, and I was a young adult then. And so that was like the first awareness of, oh, wow, we should be somewhat aware of these things and as prepared as we can for these things. And so it makes me think of that. And then I feel like, so I think that's kind of when you and I started doing a little bit of more intentional preparation. But I feel like through our whole entire marriage, 26 years, we have been, dabbling with different things that would make it so that we feel more prepared for this kind of thing. And then I think we all experienced it in 2020 with the COVID situation, and how just absolutely shocking. When you look back, it's like, did that really happen? Worldwide breaks in the supply chain, like running out of toilet paper of all things, like the bizarre situation that we all just went through and had health risks, all those things. The question marks of who to trust on the news, and like what was the government doing, and the vaccine, and all these things that were just so hard to figure out. But figuring out that, I feel like that was almost like a practice for perhaps what's to come, or maybe just like a taste of like what this could look like. And it was a good test to see like, okay, where are our gaps? What hadn't we thought of? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, and the thing that's, so confusing, I think, for a lot of Christians is, I think that there's sort of a, I would say it's similar to the short-sighted one generation strategy that so many Christians have.
Mm-hmm.
They also, I think, tend to have a hyper dependence strategy, on all the things that happen in society. Like I just see Christians being like, in debt or living paycheck to paycheck, and feeling like there's almost, because there's like, I don't want to be wealthy. I don't want to have extra resources. And so
Mm.
a lot of those ideas that I think the poverty mindset that has really infected our faith from, I would say, sort of a missionary perspective on everyone, even fathers of lots of young children, our grandfathers who are responsible for, caring for multi-generations. Like, we don't want to have, there's not a value like you have in the Jewish community of like, no, we need to be really thinking about resources, contingency plans. And so I think that, the tension that a lot of Christians feel between, verses like 1 Thessalonians 4, which is telling us, make your goal to be essentially self-sufficient as a household, which was, everyone understood that. And Paul is advocating for that. We feel a tension between that and what Jesus is saying in, places like Matthew 6, where he says, seek first the kingdom of God and all these things will be given to you as well. And it's interesting. Recently, Jordan Peterson's been quoting that verse a lot, and he's been sharing an interpretation, which is, if you are seeking first the kingdom of God, everything is going to be provided for you. And so it's really about proper orientation as opposed to a strategy for like a father's provision. Because you could say anyone who's going to college is thinking about tomorrow, because the verse ends with, and don't think about tomorrow, to worry about tomorrow, really is what he's saying. It's really a kind of relationship with God that is, you're so obsessed with the kingdom of God that you are able to be in this mindset of total trust. I think that's what Jesus is describing there. But I think that there's an extreme interpretation which tells fathers to don't plan anything. And I think that, similar to the joke, where someone's crying out to God and saying, is stranded or whatever, and all these different boats or people come by to rescue him. He just says, I'm waiting for God. And then he gets to heaven and God says, I tried to save you 3 times. When you look at like what is supposed to save your family from major events that are likely to hit, like waves. Like I said, they might only come every 100 years, but they're gonna come. And the thing that really is designed that the person who's designed to save that family is the father. And the idea of getting to build an ark with your adult sons too, like getting to have conversations with your sons or sons-in-law as you're getting older. Cause I do think that a lot of this ark building is going to really come into play in a season where you're a little bit older. It's very difficult to do this when you have little kids and you're just like, I'm just trying to like figure out how to survive. And so if, many people listening to this who might be in their early 20s or early 30s, if an apocalyptic event were to happen, they would probably move in with their parents in a lot of cases, because their parents have had way more time to pay off a house or, create some kind of stability. And I think that's totally great. Like, that's exactly what I feel responsible to do. Like, if something were to happen, I would expect our kids and grandkids would, but that means that we have to be preparing ourselves for those events. We have the time and resources to start to do that.
We saw that during COVID, right? Where people kind of collapsed back into their,
Yes.
like young adults or young families kind of collapsed back into their parents' realm of things. And of course, the government had a word for it with everyone being in their bubble or something like that. But just
Right.
that idea that there is a place where you can fall back, creating that for your kids, for your generations. It's much more, like, it takes us back to the days when survival was kind of like a daily thing. When, of course, the more of you there were, the safer or the better, the more men to defend or even whatever, back then, it does make more sense of having a place where the generations below you can kind of fall back into the
Right.
safety of numbers and togetherness. And
Yeah. And if you're listening to this and you don't have parents that are in that situation, they haven't necessarily provided or can't really help you in a case of a real kind of emergency. What we're describing here is, take the small steps and just move that direction over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. See that as a goal. That's why I love Paul's word for this, or make it your goal to become self-sufficient, right? So that you can be maximally generous. This is an actual kingdom value. This is not anti-kingdom.
right.
And so being maximally dependent on the government is going to make you not only just another person at risk who the government somehow or other organizations have to, or other families have to somehow provide for. But it also puts your whole family both up and downstream that might need you to be, a real rock in the midst of a turbulent storm. It makes you vulnerable and just another dependent person. And so I think this obsession or assumption of dependence is really such a problem. And I think it subtly creates one generational families. Part of what this whole thing is about, we're trying to encourage you guys as we're writing this book is, look, if God really has designed the family to be fruitful, multiply, fill, subdue, and rule, then every time you think about, if you're not really taking seriously the kinds of catastrophes that come in these waves, you say to yourself, like you're saying, April, about COVID, I'll never need my family. I don't need a multi-generational family. We can all spread out. Our kids can all, we can have the nest version of family. The kids will be everywhere around the country or the world. And we're completely safe. And the reason why historically that was incredibly unusual wasn't because of a vision of multi-generational family that they had to create. It was because of all of the dangers that they were preparing for. And so the assumption of stability is what has been probably the most underrated, most underrated variable that has destroyed the multi-generational family.
Yes.
When you think you can go anywhere and survive anywhere, then you start to think about yourself as an individual primarily. But when things start to happen, like when COVID hit, all of a sudden people are like, do I have a tribe? And then there were people that literally were left completely alone. They hadn't done anything to form deep bonds with other friends or family. And because of that, they were sitting in a bubble of one,
Yeah.
which is terribly sad, but preventable, right? In terms of like a structure, like we don't want to be in a bubble of one. Like we don't want to be in a bubble of like 2 parents and 4 little kids. You want to be in a tribe. You want to be in a clan. You want to be in a multi-generational family in a time like that. And that's why I think sometimes God lets major waves of chaos hit, because these are actually huge blessings, because they wake us up to why God designed things this way. But if we're not embracing God's design, if we're embracing some other design, we're saying, oh, I love hyper individualism, and I'm going to both experience that myself and then train my children in that, then you're not going to experience all the goodness that God has. And I do think the generosity thing has 2 edges to it. We're talking about the catastrophic edge, but there's another edge on the other side, which is abundance creates the opportunity to maximally give hospitality to people, to be maximally generous. And Paul's constantly referring to this side of things. There's a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you're not dependent, you're self-sufficient in such a way that you can protect the vulnerable members of your family from catastrophe. And then that also allows you to be maximally generous, because now you can show hospitality to much larger groups of people. And you can create a real kingdom experience. These things are related. They're all part of the spectrum.
Yeah, I wanted to address the generosity piece of this, because if you play it out to like, a apocalyptic type event, there's so much fear in the what ifs about that. And I feel like fear could prevent you from being generous in a time when, your neighbor needs an extra blanket or an extra can of food, or all of a sudden a group shows up at your door and they're obviously in need of many things. Do you let them in? Do you, all of those things you have to kind of think through. And I do feel like generosity takes a couple things. It takes some preparation, like for those moments, so that you have extra, so that you have more, so you have the just in case, without going too overboard in your daily life. But you also want to not be living in fear and still trusting the Lord. And so I think that those things aren't always super easy to navigate. They can be gray. They're not black and white sometimes. And I can imagine in like a dire situation where that's the case, that could be maybe hard to navigate an isolated situation, but just having this heart towards generosity and practicing now while things are not scary and not, not risky, to be able to practice hospitality, practice generosity, kind of prepares your way of thinking so that when it comes time for like when the rubber meets the road, it's like, okay, here we go. Are we going to be generous in this situation? Or are we going to be fearful and hold back because we have to take care of our own? So I think that that's something as believers we really have to wrestle with almost ahead of time and get some reps in so that we understand God's heart behind the phrase or the word generosity.
That's right. Yeah. So I encourage you guys to think about, these steps, like have a plan. And I think the right way to sort of balance the like obsessive prepper, urgency. Oh my gosh, the world's going to go to hell and I'm terribly vulnerable and I'm responsible, versus the lackadaisical attitude of, oh, who cares? This will never happen. God will always protect us. As a father, I don't have any, extra responsibility to be preparing for contingencies. Like if that's the spectrum, I think kind of the balanced position that I really like is every year, do one thing a year to kind of get your family closer to this goal that Paul is describing in 1 Thessalonians 4, that I'm calling self-sufficiency. Again, I hate that phrase, but you guys know what I mean. Like, is the goal this year, well, let's just have, an emergency fund. Next year, let's like look at food. Like we don't want to be, a food security problem to happen in our family. Like let's stockpile some basic foods, even things that you constantly go through. Like if you go through peanut butter, you go through pasta, like what I like to do is take the things that we go through right now, that are kind of on the non-perishable or they don't perish as easy, and, have a year's supply or 6 months supply of that stuff and just kind of like put it in the back. And then you're grabbing from the front.
Rotating.
So, you're just rotating on it. So if something were to happen, it's not, you don't necessarily have to have like stockpiles of, freeze dried, food. You could just have lots of the food that you already eat that you're just cycling through. And so it's actually not actually costing you more money. You're just spending a little bit more in advance. So that might be a goal this year. Let's create kind of a place in our basement where we have this kind of rotating food supply. And then, like I said, then you can think about heat, you can think about water, you can think about first aid, you can think about, defense, you can think about all these things, as an annual project that you're like, and then you involve your kids in it. You talk about it, you talk about this value, you talk about this goal. We're slowly moving this direction. I like that as now if you see a giant, problem on the horizon, you could be more aggressive. But yeah, I don't, it's difficult to know. There's always somebody who's out there doing the Chicken Little thing. But someday they're going to be right. So you want to be, carefully thinking about that. So those are some of our thoughts. I don't know if you have any last thoughts about this, April, but yeah.
No, I don't think so. That's it.
Okay. Awesome, guys. Well, good luck with, building an ark, and being like Noah and learning actual practical lessons from these historical times that we are, that are described for us, in this massive sort of symbolic archetypal way that we have in the story of Noah. I think that there's sort of micro ways that we can, we could begin to learn from Noah, learn from these stories. And this is one of them that to me has been really inspirational. So thank you guys all for listening today. Thanks, April.
Well, friends, thanks for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about 1,000 Houses or discover what a season of coaching might look like for you and your household, visit 1kh.org. We'll see you for the next episode.